George Fletcher had always been the kind of man who kept moving. At 71, he still prided himself on tending his small garden every morning, carrying groceries home from the market, and joining his wife Margaret for slow evening walks around their neighborhood. His friends admired how active he was for his age, often joking that he had the energy of a man 20 years younger. But one autumn afternoon, something shifted. Climbing the front steps after a trip to the store, he felt a heaviness in his legs that was new, as if invisible weights had been strapped to his calves. He brushed it off as nothing more than fatigue from a busy day, but deep down, he felt the first flicker of worry. Over the weeks that followed, the heaviness didn't leave. In fact, it grew. Some mornings, just rising from his favorite armchair felt like an effort. He noticed himself gripping the railing tighter when climbing the stairs, something he'd never needed to do before. There were moments when his legs ached without explanation, or a strange stiffness set in after only a short rest. One evening, as he lowered himself into bed, a cramp seized his left calf so sharply that Margaret rushed over, thinking he had injured himself. George managed to laugh it off, but later, lying awake, he stared at the ceiling with a thought that chilled him. What if I'm starting to lose my independence? When he finally came to see me, his tone was half defiant, half anxious. I'm doing all the right things, he said. I eat healthy, I keep moving, I don't sit around all day. So why do my legs feel like they're turning to stone? I could see the frustration in his eyes, the quiet fear behind it. Many of my patients come to me at this stage, still active, still determined, but puzzled by changes they can't explain. They think they've done something wrong, or that they're simply getting old. But as I listened to George describe his days, I began to suspect something else was at play. You see, aging itself is not the enemy. The real problem often hides in the small, invisible shifts our bodies make as the years pass. In George's case, his muscles weren't just tired, they were undernourished. Imagine the strongest, most reliable engine you've ever owned. If you starve it of fuel or give it the wrong kind, it doesn't matter how sturdy it is. It will sputter, slow down, and eventually stall. Our leg muscles are exactly the same. They need a steady supply of hydration, minerals, protein, and good circulation to stay strong. Without it, even the most disciplined walker or gardener will start to feel those first whispers of weakness. As I explained this to George, I saw his shoulders drop just a little, as though the weight of blame was slipping away. So you're saying it's not just my age? He asked, almost in disbelief. I smiled. Not at all. Your body is simply asking for better fuel. That's when I introduced him to a small but powerful truth. Sometimes the simplest changes make the greatest difference. I told him that we would start not with pills or complicated regimens, but with what he drank each day, because what we pour into our cups can be just as important as what we put on our plates. At first, George was skeptical. Like many people, he thought drinks were just for quenching thirst or enjoying with a meal. But as I described how certain drinks could calm inflammation, restore key nutrients, and rebuild the very structure of his muscles and joints, I saw curiosity flicker in his eyes. I told him about warm golden milk that could soothe the quiet fires of inflammation, a savory broth that worked like liquid scaffolding for aging joints, and a morning smoothie that could replace cramps and fatigue with steady energy. These weren't exotic remedies. They were time-tested, simple, and already in reach. I remember the moment his expression softened, a mix of hope and determination. All right, he said, tell me where to start. It's a small sentence, but I've learned that it marks the turning point for many. Because once someone decides to try to take even one small daily action, the path ahead changes. I assured him we'd go step by step, making small adjustments that wouldn't disrupt his life, but would quietly feed his legs the strength they were missing. He agreed, though I could tell he was still wondering how much difference something so simple could make. The truth is, I've seen transformations begin with less. A cup of something warm at night, a nutrient-rich drink in the morning. These are gentle changes, but they work in the way nature intended. Slowly, steadily, without fanfare. I told George to think of it like watering a plant. One glass won't revive a wilting flower overnight, but consistent care will bring back its green leaves and sturdy stem. In the same way, his legs didn't need a miracle. They needed nourishment, day after day, until the tired muscles found their rhythm again. In the weeks that followed, George began to notice small shifts. The heaviness that once made the stairs seem daunting began to lift. His morning cramps faded into memory. One afternoon, he realized he had spent hours in the garden without feeling that old, dragging fatigue. Margaret noticed it too. She told me he was moving more easily, with a lightness she hadn't seen in months. These weren't dramatic changes, but they were real, and they were his. Now, when I see George, he often jokes that he's drinking his way back to strong legs. But beneath the humor, there's pride. He has learned that strength isn't just built in the gym or on long walks. It's built in the quiet moments, sipping something warm at night, blending something wholesome in the morning, giving his body the fuel it's been asking for. And perhaps more importantly, he's discovered that age is not a sentence of decline. It's an invitation to listen more closely to what our bodies need. That's why I share George's story with you today, because I want you to see that weakness in your legs isn't always inevitable, and it's not always a sign of irreversible aging. Sometimes it's simply a signal, a whisper that your muscles and joints need better care. And just like George, you can start answering that call right now. No complex programs, no expensive treatments, just 3 simple drinks made from everyday ingredients that can support your legs from the inside out. So as we begin this journey together, I invite you to keep an open mind. Imagine yourself in George's place, holding that first warm cup, taking the first sip, and feeling the quiet relief that comes when you give your body exactly what it's been asking for. We'll explore each drink in detail, and I'll show you how they work, why they matter, and how to weave them into your daily life without fuss. And perhaps, like George, you'll find that the road back to stronger, steadier legs begins with something as simple as what's in your glass. George Fletcher had always been a man who respected his body. He took pride in being able to keep up with his grandchildren at the park, never shying away from a walk or a little light gardening. But lately, he couldn't ignore the way his legs betrayed him. Some mornings they felt heavy, almost sluggish, as though the life had been drained out of them overnight. It was baffling, even a little insulting, for a man who had worked so hard to stay active. His mind still felt young, but his body seemed to be moving in a different direction. One crisp Tuesday morning, George was walking back from the bakery with a loaf of fresh bread tucked under his arm when it happened again. The incline up to his house wasn't steep, yet his legs began to ache halfway through. He slowed down, his breathing quickening more than it should have for such a short climb. As he reached the porch, he leaned against the railing and closed his eyes for a moment, feeling that familiar heaviness settle in. Margaret, watching from the kitchen window, came out with a concerned look. "Are you all right?" she asked. George nodded but avoided her eyes. The truth was, he wasn't sure. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table replaying the moment. He'd always thought of aging as something that would happen gradually, a slow fade, but this felt sudden, as if his body had skipped a few chapters ahead without warning. There was a quiet fear lurking beneath the surface, not just about his health, but about what it could mean for his independence. He had always been the one to carry the groceries, fix the fence, and help Margaret with the heavier chores. What would happen if he couldn't do those things anymore? The thought unsettled him deeply. When George came to see me a few days later, he told me everything. He spoke of the heaviness, the stiffness, the way his legs seemed to tire more quickly than the rest of him. As he spoke, I could hear the frustration in his voice, but also something more fragile, a hint of fear he didn't want to name. "I just don't feel like myself anymore," he admitted. That sentence hung in the air for a moment, the weight of it sinking in. For someone like George, who had always been proud of his strength and self-reliance, this was more than a physical concern. It was a challenge to his identity. I listened carefully and then explained that what he was experiencing wasn't unusual, but it also wasn't necessarily just old age. Sometimes our bodies send signals long before any serious condition develops. Fatigue in the legs, stiffness, even cramps can often be early warnings that the muscles aren't getting what they need. It could be related to circulation, nutrition, hydration, or subtle changes in muscle fibers as the years pass. The key was to listen to those signals instead of dismissing them as inevitable. George leaned back in his chair, clearly taking it all in. "So you're saying there's a reason for this? That it's not just me getting old?" I nodded. "Exactly. Your legs are asking for help, and the good news is we can give it to them." His brow furrowed slightly as he considered that. "What kind of help?" he asked. That's when I began to tell him about how simple, consistent changes, even in something as small as what we drink, can make a real difference in leg strength and overall mobility. I reminded George that our muscles are like engines. Without the right fuel, even the best maintained machine will start to slow down. He seemed to understand that immediately. We talked about how daily habits, nutrition, and hydration are often overlooked when it comes to leg health. You don't have to overhaul your life, I assured him. You just have to start giving your body the kind of support it's been quietly asking for. I could see the tension in his face ease, the way it does when someone starts to believe there might actually be a way forward. That day, George left my office with a new sense of possibility. He wasn't entirely convinced yet, but he was curious, and curiosity is the first step toward change. As he walked down the hall, I noticed he was already moving with a little more intention, as though he was testing his legs, paying closer attention to what they were telling him. That was exactly what I wanted. Because before we could talk about golden milk, bone broth, or smoothies, George needed to reconnect with the simple truth. His body was still his ally. It just needed a bit of care to keep carrying him where he wanted to go. The following week, George came back to see me with a notebook in hand. Margaret had suggested he write down what he ate and drank each day so we could look for clues. He slid the notebook across my desk, a little sheepishly. "It's probably not perfect," he said. I glanced through his notes and smiled. Breakfast was usually toast and tea, lunch was a light sandwich or soup, and dinner was something Margaret cooked, often with plenty of vegetables. On the surface, it looked healthy. But as I read more closely, I began to see what was missing. George's diet was light, perhaps too light for a man who was still fairly active. There was little in the way of high-quality protein, not much variety in minerals, and barely any nutrient-dense drinks that could help his muscles recover. "You're feeding your body," I told him, "but not always fueling it." He raised an eyebrow. "What's the difference?" I explained that feeding is about satisfying hunger, while fueling is about giving your muscles and nerves the exact building blocks they need to work at their best. And when it comes to our legs, the largest, hardest working muscles we have, that difference matters a lot. I told George that as we age, our bodies absorb nutrients less efficiently. That means even if he was eating the same foods he did 20 years ago, he might not be getting the same benefit from them now. Add to that the natural decline in muscle mass after 50, and it becomes clear why his legs might be feeling starved for energy. "Think of your muscles like a team of workers," I said. "They can only build and repair if they have the right tools. Without them, they get slower, weaker, and eventually start to complain. That's what you've been feeling." George sat back, nodding slowly. "So what exactly am I missing?" he asked. This was my moment to guide him toward the first simple changes. I told him we'd focus on 3 key things: anti-inflammatory nutrients to calm the constant wear and tear in his muscles, collagen-rich sources to help rebuild the structure of his legs, and minerals like potassium and magnesium to keep them moving without cramps. And rather than thinking about these as supplements or pills, I wanted him to think of them as drinks. Warm, comforting, easy-to-make drinks he could enjoy every single day without fuss. What I liked about this approach was that it didn't overwhelm him. George wasn't the type to overhaul his diet overnight, but he could absolutely add a cup of something nourishing to his routine. "We're going to start with drinks because they're simple," I told him, "and because the right drink, taken regularly, can start making a difference before you even notice it." He smiled at that. "Sounds almost too easy," he said, but there was a spark in his eyes now, the same look I've seen in other patients when they realize they might actually have some control over what's been troubling them. As he left that day, George promised to try whatever I suggested next. Margaret, who had joined him for the appointment, gave me a little nod of encouragement. She wanted her husband to feel strong again, not just for his own sake, but for the life they love sharing. I knew they both understood that these weren't magic fixes. They were daily acts of care, the kind of small, steady steps that can keep a man walking confidently into his 70s, 80s, and beyond. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon when George decided to take a longer walk than usual. The neighborhood kids were playing soccer in the park, and the sound of their laughter carried on the breeze. George smiled as he strolled past them, remembering when his own legs could run for hours without complaint. But halfway along the winding path, he felt that all too familiar heaviness creeping in. His steps grew shorter, and he found himself scanning for a bench. Sitting down, he rubbed the tops of his thighs and thought, "Why is this happening so quickly now?" When he got home, he mentioned it to Margaret. "I just don't get it," he said. "I'm not sick, I'm not hurt, but my legs feel like they're carrying sandbags." Margaret, always the practical one, tilted her head. Could it be the weather? Maybe you're just tired. George shook his head. No, this is different. It's like something inside my legs is slowing me down. She suggested they write down when it happened and what he had eaten or done that day, just as they had with his food journal. George agreed, though he suspected the answer wasn't as simple as being tired. At our next appointment, George shared the experience with me. He described the way his legs seemed to lose energy, as though someone had turned down a dimmer switch. I could see the frustration on his face, but I also knew what was likely behind it. George, I said gently, what you're feeling isn't unusual, and it's not just your age. In fact, there's a good chance it's something we can work on. I explained how reduced circulation, subtle inflammation, and muscle undernourishment can quietly steal strength from the legs, sometimes long before we notice other signs of aging. He listened closely, brow furrowed. So it's not just that I'm getting old? I shook my head. No, your body is telling you it needs help, not that it's giving up. The heaviness is a signal, like a warning light in your car. If we respond to it now, we can prevent it from becoming a bigger problem. George sat back in his chair, letting that sink in. He admitted that part of him had feared this was the beginning of a slow, unstoppable decline. Knowing there was a possibility to reverse it gave him a glimmer of hope. That afternoon, we made a plan. George would start adding specific, nutrient-rich drinks to his daily routine, focusing on hydration, anti-inflammatory ingredients, and muscle-repairing nutrients. I reminded him that his legs weren't failing him. They were simply running low on the right kind of fuel. And just as a plant perks up after being watered, his muscles could regain their vitality if we fed them properly. George smiled at the thought. All right, Doc, he said, let's water the garden. George had never thought much about inflammation. The word made him think of sprained ankles or swollen joints. Obvious, visible signs that something was wrong. But as we sat together in my office, I explained that inflammation can be much quieter than that. Sometimes it doesn't show itself on the surface at all. Instead, it lingers inside the body like a small fire smoldering in the background, slowly wearing down muscles, joints, and even blood vessels. For someone like George, this invisible inflammation was likely one of the biggest reasons his legs felt heavy and slow. I told him that inflammation isn't always bad. It's the body's natural way of healing after injury or fighting infection. The problem is when that healing switch never really turns off. It's like leaving a campfire burning long after you've walked away. Eventually, the heat and smoke spread where they shouldn't. In George's case, that meant his leg muscles were under constant low-grade stress. Over time, that kind of stress makes them stiffer, more prone to fatigue, and slower to recover after even mild activity. George listened carefully, his chin resting on his hand. So how do we put out this quiet fire? He asked. That's when I told him about one of my favorite evening rituals, golden milk, a warm, comforting drink made with turmeric. Turmeric contains curcumin, a natural compound with some of the most well-studied anti-inflammatory properties in the world. When paired with a bit of black pepper, the body can absorb curcumin far more effectively, giving it the power to soothe inflammation from the inside out. He raised an eyebrow. Turmeric in milk? I smiled. Yes, and don't let the simplicity fool you. This is a recipe that's been used for centuries, especially in traditional Indian and Ayurvedic medicine. And for many older adults, it's one of the most effective and enjoyable ways to calm inflammation and help tired muscles recover. George chuckled softly. I've had plenty of milk in my time, but never one that sounds like it could fix my legs. I explained that drinking golden milk in the evening could help him in 3 important ways. First, the turmeric itself would work to quiet inflammation, which would ease stiffness and soreness in his legs. Second, the warmth of the milk would naturally improve circulation, helping his muscles receive more oxygen and nutrients. And third, perhaps most importantly, drinking it before bed could promote deeper, more restorative sleep. Good sleep is one of the most underrated tools for healing muscle and joint tissue, yet it's often the first thing we overlook. George leaned back, considering this. I suppose it's a bit like giving my legs a warm blanket before bed, he said. I laughed. Exactly, but from the inside. I could see he was warming to the idea, so I gave him the simple recipe. Warm 1 cup of milk, dairy or plant-based, whichever he preferred, and whisk in half a teaspoon of turmeric powder, a small pinch of black pepper, and half a teaspoon of cinnamon. Sweeten it lightly with honey or maple syrup if he liked, and sip it slowly. Margaret, who had joined us that day, was already nodding. "I can make that for him tonight," she said. George grinned. "Guess I don't have a choice now." I reassured him that this wasn't about instant results. The key is consistency. Drink it nightly for at least 2 to 3 weeks before deciding how it's working for you. Some people notice changes sooner, but for others, it takes a little time for the body to respond. That night, George tried his first cup of golden milk. The kitchen was quiet, the lights dim, and the soft hum of the kettle filled the air. Margaret poured the warm, golden drink into his favorite mug and set it in front of him. He took a cautious sip, then another. "It's actually good," he said with a hint of surprise. The cinnamon gave it a gentle sweetness, while the turmeric brought a subtle earthiness. It wasn't just a drink, it felt like a moment of care, something done purely for his well-being. Over the next week, drinking golden milk became part of George's evening rhythm. After dinner, he'd take a slow walk around the block, then settle into his chair with a warm cup. Some nights, Margaret joined him. Other nights, he enjoyed the quiet ritual alone. He began to notice that his legs felt a little looser in the mornings. The stiffness that used to greet him as soon as he swung his legs out of bed seemed to be fading. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough for him to notice, and enough to keep him going. One Friday evening, George called me. "Doc, I think this stuff is working," he said. "Yesterday I spent the afternoon in the garden, and I woke up this morning without that usual ache in my knees. It's been months since that happened." I smiled to myself. This was exactly why I recommended golden milk so often. Not because it was a magic cure, but because it worked quietly, steadily, helping the body help itself. We talked about how inflammation had likely been fueling his discomfort for months, maybe even years, without him realizing it. "The golden milk is turning down that heat," I explained, "and the more consistently you drink it, the more your body will thank you." George admitted he'd been skeptical at first, but now found himself looking forward to it each night. "It's funny," he said. "I thought getting stronger would mean more exercise or some complicated program. Turns out it starts with a cup of milk." Margaret chimed in from the background, laughing. "And I like it because it keeps him in the kitchen with me instead of hiding in the garage." We all laughed, but there was a truth in her words. Health habits are easier to keep when they're enjoyable and shared. Golden milk wasn't just helping George's legs, it was creating a moment of connection for the two of them. A pause in their busy days to simply sit together and care for themselves. As the weeks passed, George noticed more than just easier mornings. He felt steadier on his feet, more confident walking longer distances. The cramps that sometimes woke him at night had become rare. He wasn't sprinting upstairs like a teenager, but he no longer dreaded them either. Best of all, he had begun to feel a quiet confidence returning, the belief that he still had the power to shape how his body aged. One evening, after finishing his cup, George looked at Margaret and said, "You know, I don't feel like I'm fighting my body anymore. I feel like I'm helping it." That's the moment I knew the golden milk had done more than soothe his inflammation. It had shifted his mindset, and that shift would carry him into the next step of our plan. Adding a second drink, one that would work alongside the golden milk to rebuild his leg strength from the inside out. By the time George had settled into his golden milk routine, something else had begun to change. His mornings no longer started with that stubborn stiffness in his knees, and his nightly cramps had almost disappeared. But there was still one thing bothering him. Some days, his legs felt strong and steady, while on other days, they still felt heavy after a short walk. It puzzled him. "Doc," he said during one of our check-ins, "I think the milk is helping, but my legs still get tired faster than I'd like. It's like they're strong enough, but the energy just doesn't flow right." That phrase, "the energy doesn't flow right," was George's way of describing something I'd seen many times before in older patients. Circulation that had grown sluggish with age. Poor circulation means that oxygen and nutrients don't reach the muscles as quickly or efficiently, leaving them feeling drained even when they're otherwise healthy. It also means waste products like lactic acid aren't cleared away as fast, which can add to fatigue and soreness. "Think of your legs like a busy kitchen," I told him. "If the delivery truck is late bringing ingredients, you can't cook much. And if no one takes out the trash, things start to pile up." George laughed. "So you're saying my delivery trucks are stuck in traffic?" I nodded. "Exactly. But the good news is, there's a way to clear the road." That's when I introduced him to bone broth, a warm, savory drink that's been quietly rebuilding bodies for generations. I explained that bone broth isn't just soup, it's packed with collagen, amino acids, and minerals that not only help strengthen joints and muscles, but also support the health of blood vessels themselves. Stronger, more flexible vessels mean better blood flow, and better blood flow means his muscles could get the oxygen and nutrients they needed more quickly. George tilted his head. I've had soup plenty of times, but you're saying just drinking the broth can help my legs? I smiled. It's more than just broth, it's liquid building material for your body. And because it's warm, it also helps open up blood vessels temporarily, giving your circulation a gentle push in the right direction. He raised an eyebrow. Sounds simple enough, but you're going to tell me it has to simmer for days, aren't you? I chuckled. Not days, just long enough to coax all the goodness out of the bones. I gave him the basics. Take leftover bones from chicken, beef, or even fish, cover them with water, and add a splash of apple cider vinegar to help pull the minerals into the liquid. Then let it simmer gently for 12 to 24 hours, skimming the surface now and then. The result? A rich, deeply nourishing broth that could be sipped as a drink or used as a base for soups and stews. Season lightly with salt, pepper, and maybe some garlic or fresh herbs, and you've got a warm cup that could make a real difference in how his legs felt day to day. Margaret lit up at the idea. I can make that in my slow cooker, she said. It's no trouble at all, George grinned. Looks like I'm out of excuses. That evening, they started their first batch together. By the next afternoon, the kitchen was filled with the comforting aroma of simmering broth. George poured himself a steaming mug, took a sip, and was surprised at how satisfying it felt. Hearty but light, warming him from the inside out. This, he declared, I could get used to. Over the next week, George began drinking a cup of bone broth most afternoons. He didn't expect much at first. After all, it was just broth, right? But within days, he noticed subtle changes. On his morning walks, his legs felt warmer and more responsive, as though they were waking up faster. The lingering heaviness he sometimes felt after sitting for a while seemed to fade more quickly once he started moving. And perhaps most encouraging of all, he found himself standing for longer periods in the garden without that creeping fatigue. When George came back for his next visit, he was almost cheerful about it. Doc, I think my trucks are moving again, he said with a wink. He described how he no longer felt the same urgency to sit down halfway through a walk, and how he was moving through his chores more easily. I told him that was the magic of improved circulation. It wasn't just about stronger muscles, but about feeding those muscles what they needed in real time. Bone broth was helping in two ways, by providing the raw materials for repair, and by gently supporting the very system that delivered those materials. Margaret added her own observation. He's been in the garden nearly every afternoon, she said, and not just puttering, actually working. Yesterday he trimmed the hedges without complaining once. George nodded, looking a little proud. Feels good to feel useful again. That pride was important. It wasn't just about stronger legs anymore. It was about regaining a sense of independence, of being able to do the things that made him feel like himself. I reminded him that the key to lasting improvement would be consistency. Just like with his golden milk, the benefits of bone broth would build over time. Think of it as laying bricks, I said. Each cup is another layer, slowly rebuilding the strength and resilience in your legs. George seemed to like that image. Then I guess I'll just keep building, he replied. By the end of the month, George had settled into a rhythm. Golden milk at night to calm inflammation and relax his muscles, bone broth in the afternoon to boost circulation and feed his legs the nutrients they needed. He didn't feel like he was on some restrictive program. Instead, it had become a natural part of his day. These warm drinks weren't just medicine, they were moments of care, small rituals that reminded him he was doing something good for himself. One particularly cool morning, George decided to take the long way to the park. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes you up from the inside out. As he walked, he realized something. His steps felt lighter, his legs moving with more ease than they had in months. There was no heaviness holding him back, no urge to stop and rest. He even took the longer route home, just because he could. Later, he told me about it with a smile that said more than words could. It felt like getting a piece of my life back, he said. That's the quiet power of something as simple as a warm cup. It's not flashy, and it doesn't promise instant miracles. But given time, it can change the way you move through your days, and in George's case, it was unlocking a new kind of freedom. The golden milk had soothed the fires of inflammation. The bone broth was keeping the road clear for his energy to flow. Together, they were laying the foundation for stronger, more capable legs. And as George was about to discover, there was still one more drink to add to his routine. One that would tackle the cramps that had once stolen his sleep and help him start each morning with steady, reliable strength. By the second month of his new routine, George was beginning to think of bone broth as more than just a warm afternoon drink. It had become a quiet companion to his day, a pause between chores when he could sit back, sip slowly, and feel the warmth seep into his muscles and joints. What had started as a doctor's suggestion was now a habit he actually looked forward to, not because it was medicine, but because it felt like a small gift to himself. One rainy afternoon, George sat at his kitchen table with a steaming mug of broth in hand. The scent was rich and comforting, and as he took his first sip, he felt it almost immediately, that deep, satisfying warmth that spread through his chest and down to his legs. Margaret was chopping vegetables nearby for dinner, and she glanced over. "You really do love that stuff now," she said with a smile. George chuckled. "I think I might be addicted, in the best way possible." When he first started, George hadn't understood just how much bone broth could do beyond improving circulation. But as we discussed in our earlier appointments, bone broth was essentially liquid structure, packed with collagen, gelatin, and amino acids that the body uses to repair and maintain connective tissues. That meant it wasn't just about making his muscles feel better in the short term, it was about giving his joints, tendons, and ligaments the raw materials they needed to stay strong for the long haul. I explained to George that collagen is like the scaffolding of the body. It holds everything together: muscles, bones, joints, skin, and without enough of it, the building starts to sag and creak. As we age, our bodies naturally produce less collagen, which is why joints feel stiffer, recovery takes longer, and muscles seem slower to bounce back after even mild activity. Bone broth helps fill in that gap, delivering collagen in a form the body can actually use. George nodded when I told him this. "So it's like patching the cracks in the foundation before the house starts to lean?" I smiled. "Exactly. And every cup you drink is another patch, keeping your legs, and the rest of you, steady and secure." He liked that idea. For a man who had spent much of his working life fixing things around the house, it made perfect sense. After a few weeks of regular bone broth, George began noticing changes that were harder to dismiss as coincidence. He could kneel in the garden without feeling that sharp, grinding discomfort in his knees. Standing back up no longer required bracing himself on a chair or the edge of a table. Even little things, like turning to reach for something on a high shelf, felt easier, as though his body had quietly found more flexibility and strength. "I didn't think soup could do that," he admitted with a laugh. "But here we are." Margaret noticed it too. She told me that George was spending longer stretches outside tending to the yard without stopping to rub his knees. "He's more himself again," she said. "He moves like he's not worried something is going to hurt." That, to me, was one of the most important signs of progress, not just the physical improvement, but the return of confidence in his own body. George also discovered that making bone broth had become a kind of weekend ritual. On Saturday mornings, he and Margaret would gather leftover chicken or beef bones, add them to a large pot with vegetables and herbs, and let it simmer away while they went about their day. By evening, the house would be filled with the inviting aroma of slow-cooked broth. Sometimes they'd strain it right away, other times they'd let it cool and store it for the week ahead. It was a simple, grounding routine, and one that connected them to traditions older than either of them. One evening, as we sat in my office discussing his progress, I asked George how he was feeling overall. He thought for a moment. "Better," he said simply. "I still have days when my legs feel tired, but it's not the same kind of tired. It's the kind you get from doing things, not the kind that comes out of nowhere and makes you feel like you've aged 10 years in a day." That distinction mattered. His legs were no longer holding him back. They were responding to his life, not resisting it. I reminded George that while bone broth was a powerful ally, it was just one part of a bigger picture. His golden milk at night was still helping to keep inflammation in check, while the broth was feeding his joints and muscles what they needed to stay resilient. "It's a team effort," I told him. "You're giving your body the calm it needs to heal and the building blocks it needs to stay strong." He grinned. "So when do I get to meet the third teammate?" I laughed. "Soon. But first, we're going to make sure your legs are fully ready for it." By now, bone broth had worked its way into more than just George's afternoon routine. He was adding it to soups and stews, using it as the base for rice or quinoa, and even drinking it from a thermos when he and Margaret took longer drives into the countryside. "It's not just good for my legs," he told me one day. "It feels good for all of me." That, I explained, was the beauty of real food-based remedies. They don't just target one problem. They nourish the whole system, working in harmony with the body rather than against it. And in George's case, the results were becoming obvious. His posture was a little straighter, his movements a little quicker, and his willingness to take on bigger projects around the house had returned. "I'm starting to feel useful again," he said, a touch of pride in his voice. One crisp autumn afternoon, George decided to test himself. There was a walking trail near the lake that he hadn't visited in almost a year because the last time he tried it, he had to stop halfway through and turn back. This time, armed with months of better habits and stronger legs, he made it all the way around, slowly but without stopping. When he returned home, he poured himself a celebratory cup of broth and sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. "I didn't think I'd see that trail again without feeling defeated," he told me later. "Now I know I can." For George, the power of bone broth wasn't just in the collagen or the minerals. It was in the steady, daily reminder that he could take care of himself in ways that mattered, ways that would let him keep living the life he wanted for as long as possible. It wasn't flashy. It didn't come in a bottle with a complicated label. It was just a warm cup, a simple recipe, and the willingness to show up for himself every single day. And that's the thing about rebuilding strength after it starts to fade. It's rarely about grand gestures. It's about small, consistent acts that over time stack up into something remarkable. George understood that now, and as he took another sip of his broth that evening, he knew he was ready for the next step. One that would not only keep his legs strong, but would help him wake up each morning with the kind of steady energy he thought he'd left behind years ago. That next step, a simple, creamy smoothie that would tackle the cramps that had once stolen his sleep and give his legs the mineral boost they'd been craving all along. One crisp morning, George came into my office carrying a mason jar filled with his latest batch of bone broth. He set it on the desk with a small smile. "Proof that I'm doing my homework," he said. I laughed and told him I was proud of his commitment, but as we talked, I could tell he was curious about something. "Doc," he said, leaning forward, "you've told me bone broth helps my joints and muscles, but what exactly is it fixing? What's the real problem here?" That was the perfect opening to talk about collagen. I explained to George that collagen is the most abundant protein in the human body. It's what gives our joints structure, our skin firmness, and our muscles resilience. Think of it like the ropes and scaffolding that hold a suspension bridge together. Without them, the bridge starts to sag and weaken. In our bodies, collagen plays that same role, holding our muscles, joints, and connective tissues in alignment so we can move freely and without pain. The trouble is, collagen doesn't stay plentiful forever. Starting in our late 20s, the body begins producing less of it each year. By the time we reach our 50s, collagen levels have already declined significantly. And after 60, that decline accelerates. "It's like the scaffolding is wearing thin," I told him. "Your muscles are still there, but without strong support beams, they can't perform the way they used to." George nodded slowly, beginning to connect the dots. I told him that this loss of collagen is one of the hidden reasons so many older adults feel their legs weakening, even if they're still active. Without enough collagen, joints become stiffer, muscles recover more slowly, and even a simple walk can leave the legs feeling sore or unstable. "You might not notice it all at once," I said, "but over time, it's like the ground under your feet is slowly eroding." George frowned. "That explains a lot. I thought I was just slowing down." I smiled. "You are, but not for the reasons you think. And the good news is, you can help rebuild some of that lost scaffolding." George leaned back in his chair. "So the bone broth I've been drinking, that's helping with this collagen thing?" I nodded. "Absolutely. It's one of the best natural sources of collagen and gelatin. Every cup you drink is like sending in a repair crew to patch up the worn-out beams in your body." He seemed pleased by that, but I also wanted him to understand the bigger picture. Bone broth is powerful, but it's even more effective when paired with other collagen-rich foods. Things like fish, chicken skin, egg whites, and vitamin C-rich produce that helps the body produce collagen naturally. Margaret, who had joined us for the appointment, chimed in. We eat a lot of chicken and eggs already, she said. I could add more leafy greens and citrus too. I told her that was perfect. Vitamin C is essential for collagen synthesis, and pairing it with protein-rich foods helps the body put it to use. George grinned. Guess I'll have to let you keep making those spinach salads after all. Over the following weeks, George began to notice that his legs didn't just feel stronger, they felt more stable. The wobbliness he sometimes experienced when stepping off a curb was fading. He could carry heavier loads from the car to the kitchen without feeling like his knees might buckle. And when he bent down to tie his shoes, he no longer felt the sharp, tight pull in the back of his thighs. It's not like I'm suddenly 20 again, he told me, but I feel solid, like my legs are mine again. One Saturday morning, he and Margaret went to the local farmer's market. They strolled the stalls, picking out fresh vegetables and chatting with friends. George realized halfway through that he'd been walking for over an hour without that familiar urge to find a bench. He even carried the grocery bags to the car without thinking twice. Later, as they unpacked at home, he turned to Margaret and said, "You know, I think that collagen stuff is working." I reminded George that consistency was the key. Collagen loss happens slowly, so rebuilding that strength takes time. But every cup of bone broth, every piece of protein-rich chicken, every salad filled with citrus and greens was another step toward keeping his legs strong for years to come. Think of it like tending your garden, I said. You don't plant once and walk away. You keep watering, feeding, and protecting it. That's how it thrives. George liked that analogy. Gardening had always been one of his passions, and now he saw his legs in the same way, something living and worth caring for. He began treating his daily collagen intake as a non-negotiable part of his routine. Morning walks, a protein-rich breakfast, afternoon bone broth, and his golden milk at night. These small habits were weaving together into something much bigger, a lifestyle that supported his legs from the inside out. One evening, Margaret called me to share something. "We went dancing tonight," she said with a laugh. "Nothing fancy, just a little community event. But George actually danced with me for 3 songs in a row. He hasn't done that in years. And afterward, no complaints about his knees." I could hear the joy in her voice. This wasn't just about physical strength anymore. It was about giving them moments they thought they'd lost. For George, that was the real victory. Yes, he wanted strong legs to climb stairs, carry groceries, and work in the garden. But more than that, he wanted the freedom to live without hesitation, to say yes to a walk, a trip, a dance, without worrying if his body could keep up. Collagen was helping give that back to him. Still, I reminded him that while rebuilding collagen was vital, it wasn't the whole story. Muscles also needed another kind of support, protein. Without enough protein, even the best collagen intake wouldn't fully restore his strength. The repair crew might have the scaffolding, but they'd still be missing the bricks. George listened carefully and nodded. "All right," he said, "show me where to find the bricks." That conversation would lead us into the next stage of his journey, understanding why protein matters even more after 60, and how a simple, nutrient-rich morning habit could fuel his muscles for the day ahead. George had always considered himself a decent eater. He liked eggs, enjoyed chicken, and never said no to a good steak. But as we sat together in my office one Tuesday morning, I could see from his food journal that something was missing. His protein intake, while present, was inconsistent. Some days he got enough, but on others, he barely reached half of what his body truly needed. "I thought I was doing fine," he said, glancing at the notebook. "I didn't think I needed that much protein at my age." "That's a common belief," I told him, "but it's not quite true. In fact, after 60, the need for high-quality protein actually increases. Our muscles naturally lose mass over time in a process called sarcopenia. Without enough protein, that loss accelerates, making it harder to stay strong, maintain balance, and recover from even minor strains. Think of your muscles like a wall," I explained. "Every day, a few bricks get worn down. Protein is what gives you the new bricks to keep the wall standing tall." George frowned thoughtfully. "So even if I'm eating some protein, it's not enough to keep up with what I'm losing?" I nodded. "Exactly. And here's the tricky part. As we age, our bodies also become less efficient at absorbing and using protein. That means you not only need enough protein, but you need it consistently, spread throughout the day." He raised an eyebrow. And here I thought skipping breakfast was harmless. We talked about how protein isn't just about building muscle. It's also essential for repairing tissues, producing enzymes, and even supporting the immune system. Without enough of it, the body starts to pull from its own reserves, namely the muscles in the legs, arms, and core. Over time, that loss can lead to weakness, instability, and a higher risk of falls. So those days when I feel wobbly, George said slowly, it might be because I'm running low on building material? I smiled. That's a very good way to put it. Margaret, who had joined us that day, chimed in. He's been skipping breakfast for years. I tell him it's a bad habit. George chuckled sheepishly. All right, I suppose you're both right. We agreed that skipping meals, especially the first one of the day, was like starting a road trip without gas in the tank. Sure, you might get a few miles, but sooner or later you'll sputter to a stop. I suggested a simple change: start the day with a high-protein breakfast. Eggs were an easy option, but I also introduced the idea of a protein smoothie, quick, easy, and packed with muscle-fueling ingredients. Think of it as your morning insurance policy for your legs, I told him. Once you've had it, you know your muscles have the fuel they need to carry you through the day. George liked the idea, especially since he wasn't always in the mood for a big breakfast. I could drink it while I read the paper, he said. We brainstormed a few options together: a smoothie with Greek yogurt, berries, and a scoop of protein powder, scrambled eggs with spinach and cheese, or even cottage cheese with sliced fruit. The key was to make it enjoyable so it wouldn't feel like a chore. Margaret promised she would help experiment until they found something he looked forward to. If I can get him hooked on it like I did with the golden milk, we're in business, she said with a grin. Over the next 2 weeks, George began starting his mornings with one of these protein-rich options. Some days it was a smoothie, others a hearty omelet. At first, he wasn't sure if it was making a difference, but then he noticed something small but telling. By mid-morning, he didn't feel that usual dip in energy. His legs felt steadier when he stood up from his desk, and he no longer found himself dragging by early afternoon. It's like I've got an extra gear, he told me. One Saturday, George decided to put this new extra gear to the test. He and Margaret planned a day trip to visit friends in a neighboring town. Normally, after walking through a few shops, he'd start to feel that familiar heaviness in his legs. But this time, he surprised himself. They walked for over an hour, stopped for lunch, then strolled along the river before heading home, all without that telltale urge to find a bench. It wasn't a marathon, he said later, but it was the first time in a while I didn't feel like my legs were holding me back. I reminded him that this wasn't just about one good day. It was about giving his body the raw materials it needed so those good days became the norm. You're building a reserve, I explained. Every day you give your muscles enough protein, you're strengthening the foundation. And that foundation is what will carry you through the next decade. Margaret added another benefit she'd noticed. George seemed more cheerful in the mornings. I think not running on empty helps your mood too, she said. And she was right. Stable energy and steady blood sugar from a protein-rich breakfast can do wonders for both the body and the mind. One afternoon, George stopped by my office with a smoothie in hand. Thought I'd show you I'm still following orders, he said with a wink. We laughed, but I could see that he was genuinely enjoying the changes. His steps were a little quicker, his posture a little straighter, and perhaps most importantly, he was beginning to believe in his own ability to influence how his body aged. I told George that he was now doing 3 of the most powerful things for his legs: calming inflammation with golden milk, rebuilding joint and muscle structure with bone broth, and fueling his muscles daily with protein. These 3 together, I said, are like a winning team, and you're the coach who's showing up every day to make sure they play well. George grinned. Well, Coach Fletcher likes the sound of that. Still, there was one more piece of the puzzle I wanted to introduce, something that could specifically target the cramps and nighttime discomfort he used to experience, while giving his legs a mineral boost that would make them feel even stronger in the mornings. It's not a magic trick, I told him. Just another simple drink, easy to make, that can keep your legs happy day and night. George leaned in with a smile. All right, Doc, I'm ready. What's the next play? And that, I told him, would be our next chapter. A creamy, potassium and magnesium-rich smoothie that might just become his new morning favorite. It was a breezy Thursday morning when George arrived for his check-in. He looked comfortable, relaxed, and perhaps even a bit more confident than the first time I met him. After our usual small talk, I leaned back in my chair and said, George, I want to tell you about another patient of mine. His story might sound a little familiar. George raised an eyebrow. Oh, someone with legs as stubborn as mine? I chuckled. Exactly. His name is Harold, 72 years old, retired firefighter, always active, always disciplined. But a few months ago, he came to me looking puzzled and frustrated. He was doing all the right things, staying active, eating what he thought was a healthy diet, stretching every day. But his legs, as he put it, felt like jelly in the mornings, and on top of that, he was waking up almost every night with painful cramps in his calves. George tilted his head. Sounds like me before I started all this. Exactly, I said. Harold didn't understand why this was happening. He thought maybe he wasn't exercising enough or was getting weaker because of age. But after reviewing his diet and blood work, I noticed something simple but important. His potassium and magnesium levels were low. Both are minerals the muscles rely on to function properly, to contract, to relax, and to recover. Without enough of them, cramps become common, balance can be affected, and fatigue sets in faster. George thought for a moment. I know about potassium, but magnesium? I explained that magnesium is one of the most underrated minerals for older adults. It supports over 300 processes in the body, including muscle relaxation, nerve function, and energy production. Think of potassium as the go signal for your muscles, I told him, and magnesium as the relax signal. You need both for your legs to work smoothly. Harold, as it turned out, wasn't getting nearly enough of either. And because many older adults tend to eat lighter meals or skip foods rich in these minerals, deficiencies aren't unusual. So what did you do for him? George asked. That's where the fun part comes in, I said with a smile. I suggested he start every morning with a banana almond smoothie. Bananas are rich in potassium. Almonds and almond milk are packed with magnesium. Together, they form a perfect combination for leg health, plus some plant-based protein and healthy fats to keep the muscles fueled. George leaned forward. Sounds delicious, actually. It is, I assured him, and it's simple. Here's the basic recipe. 1 ripe banana, 1 cup unsweetened almond milk, a teaspoon of almond butter, and if you like, a dash of cinnamon. Blend it until smooth and drink it in the morning, ideally after a bit of light movement like stretching or a short walk. It's creamy, naturally sweet, and satisfying, and it gives your legs exactly what they've been asking for. Harold took my advice seriously. He started having that smoothie every morning, and within 2 weeks, something remarkable happened. The nighttime cramps that had been waking him almost daily, gone. His legs felt stronger when he got out of bed. And for the first time in months, he was able to walk down the stairs in the morning without gripping the handrail like his life depended on it. George's eyes lit up. 2 weeks? That fast? Sometimes yes, I said. When your body has been running low on a key nutrient, giving it what it needs can make a difference quickly. It's like watering a dry plant. You see it perk up almost immediately. Of course, for lasting results, you have to keep going. I could see the wheels turning in George's mind. He'd already embraced golden milk at night, bone broth in the afternoon, and protein in the morning. This smoothie would be the next logical step. But more than that, I could tell he was encouraged by Harold's success. If it worked for him, George said slowly, it might just work for me. That's the spirit, I replied. You're already giving your legs anti-inflammatory support, structural rebuilding, and daily protein. This will round it out with the minerals they need to stay cramp-free and steady. Margaret, who had been quietly listening, piped up. I can make that for him tomorrow morning. I already have bananas and almond milk at home. George smiled. I guess I don't have a choice now. The next morning, Margaret blended the first banana almond smoothie for George. He was skeptical, not about the taste, but about whether something so simple could really make a difference. But the first sip won him over. Creamy, naturally sweet, with just a hint of cinnamon. All right, he said, this is something I can stick with. Over the next several days, the smoothie became part of his morning ritual. Some days, he drank it at the kitchen table while reading the paper. Other days, he poured it into a travel cup and sipped it on the porch while watching the sunrise. It didn't feel like a chore. It felt like a treat. By the end of the first week, George noticed his legs felt a little different when he got up in the morning. The heaviness was less noticeable. The small twinges of tightness in his calves had eased. And while he hadn't had serious cramps for months thanks to his other new habits, he felt even more confident that they wouldn't be coming back. One Saturday, after finishing his smoothie, George decided to spend the morning trimming the hedges and raking leaves. Normally, a few hours of yard work would leave his legs tired and tight. But this time he noticed he wasn't slowing down nearly as much. Margaret noticed too. "You've been out there for 3 hours," she said, leaning out the window. "Aren't you tired yet?" George smiled. "Not really. I actually feel good." That afternoon, when he told me about it, I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Doc, I think I'm starting to put all the pieces together. The golden milk calms things down, the bone broth builds me up, the protein keeps me going, and now this smoothie. It's like the missing puzzle piece," I nodded. "Exactly. You're supporting your legs from every angle now. And the best part? You're doing it with real food, not pills. You're giving your body what it recognizes and knows how to use." George leaned back, a thoughtful look on his face. "You know, when I first came to you, I thought you'd just tell me to exercise more or take some supplements. I didn't think we'd be talking about milk, broth, and smoothies." I smiled. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most powerful, especially when you use them consistently. You've built yourself a daily rhythm that your body can count on. And over time, that's what creates lasting change. George raised his smoothie cup in a small toast. "To Harold," he said. I laughed. "And to you, George, because you're proving that it's never too late to give your legs the care they deserve." As he left that day, I could see the difference in his stride, not just stronger, but steadier. The kind of walk that comes from knowing your body is on your side again. And I knew that with every golden cup, every savory sip, and every creamy smoothie, George was walking further away from the fear of decline and closer to the kind of life he wanted to keep living. George had already been enjoying his banana almond smoothie for a couple of weeks when he realized something surprising. He hadn't thought about nighttime cramps in days. It wasn't that they'd been a major problem recently. His golden milk and improved hydration had already reduced them. But before this smoothie, there was always a hint of tension in his calves when he crawled into bed. That faint tightness was gone now, and he didn't miss it one bit. It happened one evening when George was settling into bed with Margaret. As he pulled the covers over himself, he stretched his legs, a habit he'd developed to check for that familiar, creeping stiffness. Nothing. No pulling sensation, no warning twinge. He lay back with a little grin. Margaret noticed immediately. "What's that look for?" she asked. "Just thinking," he replied. "I think my legs are finally happy." The next morning, as he sipped his smoothie on the porch, George thought back to the first time a cramp had jolted him awake months earlier. It had been so sudden, so sharp that he'd nearly fallen out of bed. Back then, he had no idea what had caused it. He just blamed it on getting older. But now he knew better. His body had been trying to tell him something. It was running low on the minerals and nutrients his muscles needed to relax properly. Bananas were providing him with potassium, which helps regulate muscle contractions and prevents that seizing, locked-up feeling. Almonds and almond milk were giving him magnesium, which helps muscles release and recover. Together, they were restoring the natural rhythm of contraction and relaxation that his legs had been missing. The smoothie had quickly become more than just a drink. It was a morning ritual he actually looked forward to. Sometimes he'd add a handful of spinach for an extra nutrient boost. Other days, a sprinkle of chia seeds or flax for fiber and omega-3s. If he was feeling indulgent, he'd toss in a few frozen berries for a tart sweet kick. No matter the variation, it always left him feeling satisfied and steady, ready to take on the day. One particularly hot afternoon, George even made a chilled version, blending in a few ice cubes until it was almost like a milkshake. "If healthy eating had tasted like this when I was younger," he told Margaret, "I'd have been a saint." She rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her smile. By the third week, something else became clear. George wasn't just avoiding cramps. His mornings felt smoother, more energized. He noticed it when he took his first steps out of bed. No hesitation, no awkward stiffness, no shuffling until his legs woke up. Instead, he could walk straight to the kitchen, put on the kettle, and start his day without that cautious testing stride. He mentioned it to me during our next appointment. "Doc, I think this smoothie is doing more than stopping cramps. It's like my legs are fresher in the mornings." I explained that it made perfect sense. Those minerals were helping keep his muscles properly hydrated and supported overnight, preventing the microtension that can build up while sleeping. In turn, that meant his legs could start the day without having to shake off stiffness. Margaret had her own observations. "He's not doing that little hop anymore," she said. George looked puzzled. "What hop?" She laughed. "When you used to stand up after sitting too long, you'd sort of hop in place to loosen your legs before walking. You haven't done it in weeks." George hadn't even noticed, but now that she said it, he realized she was right. That absent-minded little hop had been his body's way of working around discomfort. Now it wasn't necessary. The changes were subtle, but added up in meaningful ways. He could go from sitting to standing without that slow, bracing push. His balance when stepping onto the porch or down the front steps felt more sure-footed. And perhaps most importantly to George, he wasn't worrying about his legs misbehaving in the middle of the night or first thing in the morning. One evening, while reading in bed, George thought about Harold, the retired firefighter whose story had inspired him to try the smoothie in the first place. He made a mental note to thank him if they ever crossed paths. This was the missing piece, George thought. The milk keeps me loose, the broth keeps me built, and this smoothie keeps me steady. His growing confidence was starting to influence his choices. When Margaret suggested a weekend trip to the coast, something he'd hesitated to agree to in the past because of the amount of walking, George said yes without a second thought. And sure enough, during the trip, he kept up just fine. They strolled along the boardwalk, wandered through small shops, and even climbed the steps to a lookout point overlooking the ocean. Not bad for an old man, he teased, and Margaret just squeezed his hand. That trip was a turning point. For months, George had been building his routine piece by piece. Golden milk at night to fight inflammation, bone broth in the afternoon to strengthen joints and improve circulation, protein-rich mornings to fuel his muscles, and now the potassium-magnesium smoothie to keep cramps at bay. Each piece worked in harmony with the others, and George was living proof of what consistency could do. It wasn't magic. His legs didn't feel like they did at 25, but they felt reliable, dependable, and that was worth more than he could say. I don't need to run marathons, he told me later. I just need to know that when I want to go somewhere, my legs will take me there without complaint. And that's exactly what they were doing. Still, I reminded George that even the best routines can slip if we aren't careful. The reason you're doing so well now, I said, is because you've made this a daily habit. If you let it slide, some of those old issues could creep back in. George nodded firmly. Not a chance. I like feeling like this too much. Margaret smiled knowingly. And I like having him like this too much. She admitted she was enjoying their longer walks, his renewed enthusiasm for gardening, and even his willingness to help with bigger house projects without worrying his legs would give out. One morning, George decided to share his smoothie recipe with his neighbor Frank, who had been complaining about leg cramps. Frank was skeptical but intrigued. If it's good enough for you, maybe I'll give it a shot, he said. George grinned. Just don't skip it. You've got to give it a fair 2 weeks. Passing on the advice felt good, like paying forward the help he'd gotten from Harold's story. George had come a long way from that first appointment when he'd sat across from me, frustrated and uncertain about his leg's future. Now he was the one encouraging others, living proof that even in your 70s, you can turn things around with the right fuel and the right habits. And as George sipped his smoothie one sunny morning, watching the world wake up from his porch, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: trust. Trust in his legs, trust in his body, and trust in himself to keep going strong. By now, George's mornings had become something of a ritual. Golden light spilling through the kitchen window, the gentle hum of the blender, and that creamy banana almond smoothie poured into his favorite tall glass. He didn't think of it as a treatment anymore. It was just part of who he was now, as natural as tying his shoes before a walk. And yet, even though he'd been enjoying the benefits for weeks, he realized he didn't fully understand why it was working so well. One afternoon, as we sat across from each other in my office, he asked, "Doc, I know the smoothie is helping, but why exactly do potassium and magnesium work so well together? Why not just one or the other?" I smiled because this was the question I had been hoping he'd ask. "Think of your muscles like a door," I said. "Potassium is what helps open the door so your muscles can contract. Magnesium is what helps close the door so they can relax. If you only have potassium, the door might open, but it won't close smoothly. If you only have magnesium, the door might close, but it won't open as easily. You need both for the door to work properly." George chuckled. "So my legs are basically made of doors?" "In a way," I replied with a grin. "Every step you take, every time you get up from a chair, those muscles are opening and closing, contracting and relaxing. Without the right balance of potassium and magnesium, things get messy. You get cramps, fatigue, or that strange, heavy feeling you used to complain about." He leaned back, thinking it over. "So when I was getting those cramps at night, it was because the door was stuck open?" "That's one way to put it," I said. "Your muscles were contracting but struggling to relax. That's why the cramps were so sudden and painful. And because you didn't have enough potassium and magnesium reserves, your legs couldn't reset properly overnight. George nodded slowly. Makes sense. And now with the smoothie, I'm basically oiling the hinges every morning. Exactly, I said. That's why you feel steadier in the mornings and why those cramps have disappeared. Margaret, who had been listening from the corner of the room, added, and why he's been in a better mood, I think. George laughed. I suppose not waking up in pain will do that for a man. We talked more about how these minerals aren't just for preventing cramps. Potassium helps maintain healthy blood pressure and fluid balance, both important for circulation. Magnesium plays a role in nerve health, bone strength, and even energy production at the cellular level. In short, I told him, these two minerals aren't just good for your legs, they're good for your whole body. But your legs, because they're working all day to carry you around, really feel the difference first. George thought about that for a moment. It's funny, he said. I used to think that if I wanted stronger legs, I needed to push them harder, walk more, climb more stairs. But now I see it's as much about what I give them as what I ask of them. That's exactly right, I replied. Muscles aren't built just in the gym or on the sidewalk. They're built in the kitchen too, with every choice you make about what to put in your body. He sipped some water and smiled. Well, I suppose I've become a morning mineral man now. Over the next week, George started talking more about his perfect duo to anyone who'd listen. One morning, while chatting with his neighbor Frank over the fence, George told him, "You've got to give your legs the right handshake every day, potassium in one hand, magnesium in the other. That's how they agree to keep working for you." Frank laughed, but George could tell he was thinking about it. Margaret teased him for becoming the neighborhood leg health ambassador, but she admitted she was proud of how far he'd come. "When you first started all this, you were just hoping not to get worse," she told him one evening. "Now you're actually getting better, and you're helping other people see they can too." George smiled at that. He remembered how helpless he'd felt before, sitting in my office that first day, convinced his independence was slipping away. And now he not only felt stronger, but understood why he felt stronger. That knowledge made him more committed than ever. One Sunday afternoon, George put his newfound knowledge to the test. He and Margaret went on a longer than usual walk around the lake. The path wound through shaded trees, up gentle slopes, and across small wooden bridges. In the past, he would have started feeling that familiar heaviness by the halfway mark. But this time, his legs felt light and responsive, carrying him steadily the whole way. When they reached the final stretch, he even suggested a short detour to see a patch of wildflowers blooming nearby. That night, as he settled into bed, George thought about the day. He'd spent hours on his feet, walked more than he had in months, and not once did his legs protest. It wasn't about speed or distance, it was about the quiet confidence of knowing his legs were ready to do what he asked of them. The next morning, as he poured almond milk into the blender, George realized something else. The smoothie wasn't just a drink anymore, it was a promise, a way of telling his body, "I'm giving you what you need to keep me moving." I reminded him during our next appointment that maintaining the right balance of potassium and magnesium wasn't just about avoiding deficiency. It's about building resilience, I said. You're not just preventing problems, you're creating a foundation that will keep you steady for years to come. George nodded. That's the plan. I've got too many places to go to be worrying about falling behind. And as we wrapped up our conversation, I hinted at the next step in his journey. You've mastered the perfect duo, I told him. Now we're going to focus on the small habits that turn all this good work into lasting strength. The things you do every single day without thinking, the habits that years from now will keep you walking strong. George grinned. All right, Doc, bring on the next lesson. My legs are ready. By the time George had woven golden milk, bone broth, protein-rich breakfasts, and his banana almond smoothie into his daily routine, I could tell his legs were no longer the same legs he'd walked in with months ago. They were steadier, stronger, and far more reliable. But I also knew that if we wanted these gains to last, the next step was just as important as everything he'd already done, turning them into automatic daily habits that required little thought but delivered big results over time. George, of course, had his doubts. Doc, he said one morning, I'm not sure I'm a habit guy. I do things when I remember to, but I've never been the type to stick to a strict routine. I smiled. That's the beauty of small habits, George. They don't feel like a strict routine. They slip into your life so naturally That one day you look up and realize you've been doing them for months without even noticing. I explained to him that habits are like invisible scaffolding for your health. They support you quietly in the background, freeing up your mind and willpower for other things. The key was to start small and attach each new habit to something he was already doing. You drink your smoothie every morning now without thinking, right? I asked. He nodded. That's because you paired it with reading the paper on the porch. You tied it to something you enjoy. That's how we're going to build the next layer. We started with movement. I didn't want George to think of it as exercise, a word that can feel intimidating or like a chore. Instead, we called it his wake-up walk. As soon as he finished his smoothie, he'd take a short walk down the block and back, maybe longer if the mood struck. It wasn't about distance or speed. It was about telling his legs, I'm here and I'm using you. The more often he did it, the more natural it would feel. George took to the idea quickly. The first few mornings, he went alone, enjoying the quiet streets and fresh air. By the end of the week, Margaret had joined him, and it became their little morning ritual. They'd wave to neighbors, watch the flowers change with the seasons, and chat about their plans for the day. I didn't think I'd like walking right after breakfast, George admitted to me later, but now it feels strange if I don't. The next habit was what I called movement breaks. I knew George could spend hours in his workshop tinkering with tools, or at the kitchen table reading. That meant long stretches of sitting, which isn't great for circulation or muscle health, so we set a simple rule. Every hour, he'd stand up and take a short lap around the house or the yard. Sometimes he'd just walk to the kitchen to refill his water glass. Other times, he'd step outside to check the garden. It didn't matter what the activity was. What mattered was breaking up the sitting time. Margaret was happy about this one. He used to disappear into that workshop for hours, she said. Now I see him pop in and out all day. He even checks on the laundry more often. I'm not complaining. George grinned sheepishly. It's true. I feel better when I keep moving instead of parking myself for half the day. The third habit was what I called evening ease. Many people let their activity level drop completely after dinner, but a little gentle movement in the evening can keep circulation flowing and prevent stiffness overnight. For George, that meant a slow stroll around the block after the dishes were done. Some nights, it was just 5 minutes. Other nights, they'd walk a little farther, enjoying the quiet streets under the glow of the street lamps. He found that those short evening walks made it easier to fall asleep and helped him wake up with less stiffness. We also talked about simple, strength-building habits that didn't require gym equipment. For example, every time George climbed the stairs, he'd pause halfway and do a few slow calf raises, holding onto the railing for balance. Or when he bent to pick something up, he'd squat instead of bending at the waist, using his leg muscles intentionally. These micro-strength exercises, done consistently, added up over time without feeling like a workout. Another habit we added was hydration awareness. George admitted he often forgot to drink enough water, especially on cooler days. We made it simple. 1 glass of water when he woke up, 1 before lunch, and 1 before dinner. The rest could be tea, broth, or other drinks, but those 3 glasses were non-negotiable. I didn't realize how much better my legs feel when I'm hydrated, he said a week later. They don't get that heavy, dragging feeling as easily. Margaret decided to join him in most of these habits, which made them even easier to keep. It's funny, she told me one afternoon. We started all this to help George's legs, but now we're both feeling better. I think we've walked more together in the last 2 months than we have in the last 2 years. George nodded. And we're talking more too. It's not just about the walking, it's about the time. That's the quiet magic of small habits. They don't just strengthen your legs, they strengthen your life. George was no longer thinking about his routine as a list of things to do. It had become woven into the rhythm of his days. The smoothie in the morning, the short walks, the movement breaks, the gentle evening strolls. And because these habits were tied to things he enjoyed, they didn't feel like chores. They felt like choices he wanted to make. One sunny Saturday morning, George and Margaret decided to visit the botanical gardens a few towns over. It was a place they loved but had avoided in recent years because of all the walking involved. This time, they strolled the winding paths for hours, stopping to admire the roses and watch the koi fish in the ponds. They even climbed the gentle hill to the overlook, where they could see the gardens stretch out below them in full bloom. As they walked back to the car, Margaret squeezed his hand. I think your legs passed the test today, she said. George grinned. I think they did too. Later, over dinner, George reflected on how far he'd come. I used to think strong legs were about doing big things, heavy workouts, long hikes, but now I see it's about the small things you do every day without fail. They build on each other until one day you realize you can do the big things again. I couldn't have said it better myself. Before he left my office at our next appointment, I reminded him of something important. George, the beauty of these habits is that they're yours now. You've built them, you've lived them, and they've carried you this far. If you keep them going, they'll carry you for many more years. George smiled. I'm not planning to stop. Besides, I've got a morning smoothie to drink and a garden to check on. And as he walked out, his stride easy and sure, I knew those small habits had done exactly what they were meant to do. Not just strengthen his legs, but give him a life he could keep living on his own terms. George liked to joke that I'd given him a full-time job taking care of his legs, but deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't a job anymore. It was just who he was now. The golden milk in the evening, the bone broth in the afternoon, the protein breakfast, the banana almond smoothie in the morning, the short walks, the movement breaks, they weren't separate tasks to check off a list. They had become part of his day in the same way brushing his teeth or locking the front door had always been. One morning, as we sat in my office for his regular check-in, I asked him what he thought had made the biggest difference. He didn't hesitate. Consistency, he said simply. I think that's the whole trick. You can have the best plan in the world, but if you only do it once in a while, it's useless. It's like planting seeds and never watering them. I smiled because he was right. I told him that most people fail not because they don't know what to do, but because they don't keep doing it long enough to see the results. Your body responds to the messages you send it every day, I explained. If the message is, I'm going to care for you and give you what you need, your body will respond by getting stronger and staying stronger. But you have to keep sending that message. George nodded. That's the difference this time. In the past, I'd try something for a week, maybe two. If I didn't feel a huge change right away, I'd quit. This time, I stuck with it, even when the changes were small. Margaret, who had joined us that day, smiled and added, and even when the changes were invisible, sometimes I think the most important part was that he didn't wait for proof before he believed it was working. He just kept going. George laughed. That's only because you kept handing me that smoothie every morning. We talked about how consistency works like compound interest. Just as a little money invested regularly can grow into something substantial over time, small, repeated acts of care for the body add up to big results. You don't see it day to day, I told him. But then one day, you realize you're doing things you couldn't do 6 months ago without even thinking about it. George thought back to the day they visited the botanical gardens and how easy it had felt to walk the long paths. That's exactly it, he said. I wasn't thinking about my legs the whole time. I was just enjoying the day. I think that's when you know you've made progress, when you stop worrying about the thing that used to slow you down. But staying consistent wasn't always effortless. George admitted there were mornings when he didn't feel like making his smoothie, afternoons when he considered skipping the broth, or evenings when the golden milk felt like too much fuss. But he had learned to push past those moments, reminding himself why he started. I ask myself, do you want to go back to how things were? And the answer is always no. Margaret had her own strategy for keeping him on track. She made sure the ingredients for his drinks were always in the house and easy to find. She kept the blender clean and ready, stocked the pantry with turmeric and cinnamon, and froze extra portions of bone broth so they were always available. I figure if I make it easy, he'll keep doing it, she said. Her approach worked, but George also developed his own mindset shift. I stopped thinking of it as something optional, he told me. I treat it like my morning shower. You don't skip your shower because you're tired or busy. You just do it. Same with this. And in truth, that's what consistency looks like. Turning the things that keep you well into non-negotiables. It doesn't mean you have to be perfect. George missed a day here and there, just like anyone else. But he always came back to his routine the next day without beating himself up. We also discussed how to stay motivated in the long term. One trick I suggested was keeping a simple journal of wins, not weight or measurements, but real-life victories. Things like walked around the lake without stopping, carried groceries without feeling winded, or danced with Margaret for 3 songs. George liked the idea and started jotting down moments he was proud of. A month later, he showed me the list with a smile. It's a lot longer than I thought it would be. He also found that sharing his progress with others helped. Talking to his neighbor Frank about the smoothie, telling friends about golden milk, even offering bone broth recipes. It reminded him of how far he'd come and encouraged him to keep going. "It's harder to quit when people are watching," he said with a laugh. But more than anything, George had come to enjoy the process itself. He liked the quiet satisfaction of starting his day with a nourishing drink, the comforting warmth of bone broth on a cool afternoon, the gentle stretch of his evening walk. "It's not just about fixing my legs anymore," he said. "It's about living in a way that makes me feel good every day." Margaret noticed the difference too. "He's lighter, not just in his step, but in his mood. I think consistency has given him confidence again." And she was right. George carried himself differently now, not with arrogance, but with a steady assurance that his body would support him in whatever he wanted to do. One crisp fall afternoon, George decided to tackle a small project in the yard that he'd been putting off for months, repairing the old wooden gate. It meant carrying tools back and forth, squatting to work on the hinges, and standing for long stretches. A year ago, it would have left his legs sore and tired for days. This time, he finished the job without a second thought. Later, as he and Margaret admired the freshly hung gate, he realized he'd just spent hours on his feet without even noticing. That was the reward for his consistency. Freedom from constant worry about his legs. At our next appointment, I reminded him that this consistency was the foundation for everything else he wanted to do in life. "It's not the big efforts that change you most," I told him. "It's the little ones you do over and over. That's what makes recovery last." George nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I think I finally get it. You don't need to do something huge to change your life. You just need to do something small and keep doing it." And that's when I knew George wasn't just on the road to recovery. He was walking a path he could stay on for the rest of his life. Because once you understand the true power of consistency, you never want to go back. George never liked to think of himself as old. He preferred the term seasoned, or sometimes when he was feeling cheeky, experienced. But deep down, he knew that age had been sitting in the back of his mind like a quiet shadow, whispering doubts. When his legs had first started feeling heavy and unreliable, those whispers had grown louder. Maybe this is just what happens now. Maybe I can't expect much more. Back then, every ache and stiffness felt like confirmation of that fear. He didn't realize it at the time, but those thoughts had started shaping the way he moved. He became more cautious, slowing down on the stairs, avoiding longer walks, even hesitating before bending or lifting. It wasn't just his legs holding him back. It was his mindset. Now, months later, as he stood in his kitchen pouring almond milk into the blender for his morning smoothie, George could feel how much that mindset had shifted. His legs weren't perfect, they still had their limits, but they no longer felt like a liability. They felt like partners, and with that, the way he thought about himself had changed too. It started subtly. The first time he realized he'd walked around the block without thinking about his legs. The first time he carried the grocery bags inside without a pause. The first time he knelt in the garden to pull weeds and stood up again without that sharp jolt in his knees. Each moment was a quiet reminder that his body could still do more than he'd been giving it credit for. One afternoon, he was talking with Margaret over tea when she said something that stuck with him. "You know, you used to move like you were bracing for something bad to happen. Now you just move." George smiled. "That's because I trust my legs again." That trust had been missing for a long time, and rebuilding it wasn't just about turmeric, bone broth, or smoothies. It was about proving to himself, day after day, that he could depend on his body. The drinks and habits gave his legs the fuel and support they needed, but it was the steady rhythm of success. No cramps in the night, no heavy legs in the morning, no sudden wobble on the stairs, that built back his confidence. It also changed the way he approached opportunities. Before, he would hesitate before saying yes to certain things. A trip that involved a lot of walking, a social event that might mean standing for hours, even a casual stroll with friends who walked at a brisk pace. Now, his default answer was yes. Not because he knew he could keep up perfectly, but because he no longer feared being held back by his legs. One example came just a few weeks earlier. A neighbor invited him to join a small group walking tour of a historic district in the city. It would mean several hours on his feet, something George would have politely declined before. But this time he said yes. On the day of the tour, he kept pace easily, chatting with the others and even offering to take a few photos for the group. At the end, while some of the younger participants were rubbing their feet, George was still smiling. It's nice not to be the one falling behind, he thought. That experience reinforced something important. His limits were further out than he'd imagined, and every time he tested them, they seemed to move a little farther. It wasn't just about strength or endurance either. George noticed he carried himself differently now. His posture was straighter, his stride more assured. He no longer walked like someone guarding a fragile part of himself. Instead, he walked like a man who knew exactly where his feet would land with each step. That confidence was visible, and people responded to it. Friends commented on how well he was moving. Even strangers smiled more when they passed him on the sidewalk. I reminded George during one of our appointments that this mindset shift was as valuable as any physical change. When you believe your body can support you, I said, you move in ways that actually make it stronger. But when you're afraid it can't, you move in ways that make it weaker. He nodded slowly. I suppose I've been training my legs without even realizing it, just by trusting them more. Margaret noticed it in little moments too. You take the stairs without me having to ask if you're sure, she told him one evening. And you walk across the lawn even if it's a little uneven. You didn't used to do that, George laughed. That's because I don't feel like I'm going to topple over anymore. But perhaps the most profound change was in how he saw aging itself. He no longer viewed it as an inevitable slide into weakness. Instead, he saw it as a process he could influence. Not control completely, he was realistic, but influence in meaningful ways. I can't stop the years from passing, he told me, but I can make sure they don't push me around. This shift also meant George no longer chased quick fixes. He understood now that the key wasn't doing something dramatic for a short burst of time. It was doing small, nourishing things consistently. That truth had freed him from the cycle of trying, stopping, and starting over. I'm in this for the long game now, he said, and the long game is much easier when you like what you're doing. And he did like it. The golden milk was comforting. The bone broth was satisfying. The smoothie was refreshing. The walks with Margaret were peaceful. These weren't chores, they were pleasures. That, more than anything, was what made them sustainable. One Saturday morning, George was chatting with Frank, his neighbor, who had been struggling with his own leg cramps. George told him, "You've got to start treating your legs like they're your teammates, not your enemies. Give them what they need, trust them to do their job, and they'll surprise you." Frank chuckled. "You sound like a coach," George grinned. "Maybe I am. A coach for one." That afternoon, while trimming the hedge, George thought about how far he'd come. The fear that used to hover in the background was gone. In its place was a quiet confidence, not arrogance, just a steady belief in his own ability to move, to live, to enjoy. And he realized that belief wasn't fragile anymore. It was rooted in months of proof. The legs he'd once viewed as a problem were now a source of pride. And the man who once saw himself as slowing down had discovered that he was still capable of moving forward, not just in body, but in mind. That's the real power of a mindset shift. It changes what you think you can do, and that changes what you actually do. As George sat down that evening with his warm cup of golden milk, he thought about the days ahead. He knew there would be challenges. There always are. But he also knew something far more important. He had the tools, the habits, and the mindset to meet them. And with that, his confidence was steady, just like his legs. For George, the word freedom had always meant something bigger than just being able to go where he pleased. It meant not having to second-guess himself, not hesitating before saying yes to the things he loved, not calculating how far he could walk before the heaviness in his legs would set in. Months ago, that freedom had started to slip away without him realizing it. Every time he avoided a longer walk, every time he turned down an invitation that involved standing for too long, every time he opted for the easier route instead of the stairs, he had been quietly surrendering pieces of his independence. Back then, he told himself it was just being practical, but deep down, he knew it was fear. Now, as he stood on his porch on a bright spring morning, he could feel how far he had come. The soft hum of the blender in the kitchen told him Margaret was making their morning smoothies. The day stretched ahead of him with no limits, no hidden calculations about what he could or couldn't do. His legs, once the reason for so much doubt, now felt like his partners again. It wasn't just the absence of pain or stiffness, it was the presence of confidence. George knew that if he wanted to walk into town, work in the garden all afternoon, or wander through the park with Margaret, his legs would carry him without protest. They'd been tested in gardens, on neighborhood walks, on longer day trips. And they had passed every time. That freedom didn't come from luck, it came from work, small, steady work. The golden milk that soothed inflammation, the bone broth that rebuilt the structure of his joints, the protein that fueled his muscles, the smoothie that kept cramps at bay, the short walks, the movement breaks, the evening strolls. The habits he'd built piece by piece until they became as natural as breathing. One Saturday, George and Margaret decided on a whim to drive to the coast. They parked near the dunes and set out on a long stretch of beach. The wind was brisk, the waves rolling in gentle arcs, the sand firm beneath their feet. They walked for nearly an hour, stopping now and then to watch seabirds skimming the surf. Not once did George think about his legs. Not once did he wonder if he should turn back early. It wasn't until they reached the car, brushing sand from their shoes, that it struck him. This was the kind of outing he used to avoid. Not because he didn't want to go, but because he couldn't trust his body to handle it. And here he was, not just handling it, but enjoying every step. That night, as they sat together, sipping their golden milk, Margaret smiled. "You know," she said, "we've been doing more together lately than we have in years. I think your legs have given us both some freedom back." George nodded. "It's funny, I thought getting older meant narrowing your world. But now, I think it just means you have to be more deliberate about keeping it wide." And that was the truth he discovered. Strong legs didn't just keep you moving, they kept your life open. Without them, even small pleasures, walking the dog, exploring a market, standing in the kitchen, cooking with someone you love, can feel out of reach. With them, the world feels accessible again. George had also learned that strength isn't just in the muscle. It's in the habits you protect and the choices you make every day. It's in saying yes to the small things, the short walk, the nourishing drink, the stretch before bed, because those small things quietly build into something much bigger. His legs were proof of that now. They weren't what they were at 30, but they were reliable, capable, and steady. And that steadiness had unlocked the kind of freedom he thought he'd lost for good. One afternoon, as he was working in the garden, Frank from next door called over the fence. "You've been busy out here lately," Frank said. "You must be feeling good." George grinned. "Better than I have in a long time. Turns out if you take care of your legs, they take care of you right back." Frank laughed. "Sounds simple when you put it like that." George shrugged. "It is simple. Not always easy, but simple. You just have to keep showing up for yourself." That, more than anything, was the lesson George wished he could hand to everyone who felt their independence slipping. You don't have to accept decline as inevitable. You don't have to live smaller and smaller because your legs feel weaker. You can fight for your freedom, not with grand gestures, but with daily, deliberate care. And maybe that's why, on evenings when the sky glows gold and the air is soft, George and Margaret still take their slow walks around the block. Not because they have to, but because they can. Every step is a quiet reminder of what's possible when you choose to support your body instead of resigning yourself to its limits. George no longer thinks of his legs as the first part of him to weaken. He thinks of them as the foundation that lets him keep the rest of his life strong. They carry him to the places that matter: the garden, the market, the beach, the kitchen table where he and Margaret share their meals. They're his link to the people and experiences that make life rich. And as long as they keep carrying him, steady, supported, and strong, George knows he'll keep carrying this freedom forward. Because in the end, strong legs aren't just about mobility. They're about independence. They're about dignity. They're about waking up each day knowing you can go where you want, do what you love, and live on your own terms. And that, George thought as he sipped the last of his golden milk one quiet evening, is the kind of freedom worth working for every single day. Over these past months, George's journey has been nothing short of remarkable. He began in a place so many of us know well, with legs that felt heavier than they should, mornings clouded by stiffness, and a quiet fear that his independence might be slipping away. At first, every step felt uncertain, every outing carried a question mark. But slowly, through small and consistent acts of care, that uncertainty began to fade. Golden milk in the evenings soothed the inflammation that had quietly been wearing him down. Bone broth nourished his joints and improved circulation. A protein-rich start each morning fueled his muscles, while a simple banana-almond smoothie delivered the minerals that ended his nighttime cramps. Gentle walks, small strength-building movements, and daily hydration stitched these habits together into a rhythm George could keep for life. With each passing week, his legs didn't just grow stronger, his confidence returned. He said yes to longer walks, to outings he once avoided, even to the joy of spontaneous adventures. And somewhere along the way, he stopped thinking about his legs as a weakness. They had become his partners again, carrying him steadily into the life he wanted to live. George's story is a reminder that strength isn't built in a single day and freedom isn't regained in one leap. It comes from showing up for yourself every day in small ways that add up to something extraordinary. So if your own legs have been whispering for help, listen and answer. The journey back to confidence begins with one small choice, one nourishing habit, one step forward, because it's never too late to walk into a stronger, freer chapter of your life. Mota. Do your legs feel heavier than they used to? Do you wake up with stiffness or worry that they aren't as steady as before? It's not always just age. Sometimes your legs are quietly asking for the right kind of care and nourishment. In this video, you'll follow the inspiring journey of George Fletcher, a 71-year-old who transformed his leg strength and confidence through 3 simple natural drinks and small daily habits. From golden milk that soothes inflammation, to bone broth that rebuilds joints, to a potassium-rich smoothie that ended his nighttime cramps. These changes didn't just strengthen his legs, they gave him back the freedom to live life without hesitation. Whether you're 60, 70, or beyond, these are practical, science-backed habits you can start today. No pills, no expensive treatments, just gentle, consistent steps towards stronger legs and greater independence. If your goal is to keep walking confidently into the years ahead, this is your invitation to begin. Which of these habits will you try first? Share your thoughts in the comments.